Number is on the rise. And so when I started this work, almost 10 years ago, I think the number was around 80. Now it's over 100. There are different diagnoses that are happening year after year. Some even, they change their diagnoses. They'll include some diseases that they used to call one thing now are split into different things. So it's terrifying to know that your body is screaming at you that something's not right, and to see those symptoms play out in all these different areas of my body. To call any diagnosis chronic and progressive, even if the facts point that way, that's not a way that I choose health.
They have one thing in common, and they're all women. Why are women so much more likely to develop autoimmune diseases?
There are
Is something standing between you and your happiness? It was for me. I had to face my depression and the constant negative self-talk. Therapy helped me realize I deserve to be happy. That's why this podcast is called I Choose Health, because I made the choice to heal, and I want to share that with you. As a gift to you, we've partnered with BetterHelp as our sponsor to help you start your own healing journey. We all face moments when life feels overwhelming, whether it's stress, anxiety, or just feeling stuck. Talking to someone can make a real difference. And that's where our sponsor BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp offers professional online therapy that's convenient, affordable, and entirely on your schedule. You can connect with a licensed therapist by video, phone, or even chat, whatever works best for you. Let our sponsor BetterHelp support you on your journey to better mental health. You can get 10% off your first month by going to betterhelp.com/iChooseHealth. That's betterhelp.com/iChooseHealth for 10% off your first month. Take the first step toward feeling better today.
As a teenager, I decided to live better, so I gave up the meat, eggs, and cheddar. At 20 and 30, I wanted more, so I strengthened my mind and my core. Living a life that is healthier and wealthier because I choose health.
So I remember a family friend of ours, Jen, who I believe she had lupus, and I was becoming familiar with a lot of women around me, particularly a woman of color, relatively young. I think Jen at the time had to be in her 20s. And another friend of ours who lives in Maryland was in her 40s. Speaking of having lupus, seeing a number of that, at least the awareness of that increase. And so when it came to understanding autoimmune diseases, autoimmune diseases was something that, I wasn't very familiar with. I knew that just looking at the etymology of the word itself, it was showing that the specific disease was attacking the immune system. And so that was just my extent or understanding of it to that point. So of course, I'm still not an expert in autoimmune diseases, but we definitely have someone with us who's a board certified wellness coach and then a Pharm D as well. And I want to welcome to the show Amy Behimer. So Amy Behimer, welcome to the I Choose Health podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me on. And, again, hopefully helping all of us understand autoimmune disease a little bit better.
So Amy, I was on your site and you explained how you are yourself dealing with multiple autoimmune diseases as well as dealing with MS. Can you walk us through what it was like that first day of having to deal with the reality of all of these ailments, or the first one to kind of take up residence? Like, just explain to us what that was like, processing that, and what your response was.
Sure. And, for anybody listening, whether you have an autoimmune disease or not, whether you have one, whether you have three, this episode will be for you, because the one thing that we know about autoimmunity is that it's on the rise. And there's a lot of different theories as to why that is. But for me, my first diagnosis, I was 17 and I started seeing white patches on my skin, which is an autoimmune disease called vitiligo. People know it as the disease that Michael Jackson had, and one of the reasons that he started dyeing his skin to mask it. But with the first diagnosis, it was kind of like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But it wasn't until my second diagnosis, I had already been through pharmacy school. So I knew a thing or two about the human body and about these different diseases. And the second one was in my thyroid, so Graves' disease. That's when the worry started to creep in of, okay, I know they cluster, because that's one thing that's very true. If you have one, chances of you having a second or third one is higher. And I started to feel this kind of doom of what else is coming. And a
Right.
few years later, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which is also an autoimmune disease. And so it was that diagnosis that really caused me to pause, take a look at my life, not that anybody would say, wow, she's living an unhealthy life, but really ask myself, what could I be doing different to help prevent another diagnosis? Because it's terrifying to know that your body is screaming at you that something's not right, and to see those symptoms play out in all these different areas of my body.
Yeah. Wow. You know, for someone hearing the term for the first time, what actually goes wrong in the body during an autoimmune disease?
So the commonality is that we have our immune system, and our immune system is there to protect us. It's there to fight off foreign invaders. It's there to help us with things like inflammation. And what happens when we have autoimmune disease is that it goes awry, and our immune system starts to think that the tissues that are native to us, our own tissues and organs, it thinks that they are invaders. So they start to act on them or attack them in ways that cause dysfunction down the line. So an autoimmune disease describes any of those scenarios, and it can look like so many different things. Like you mentioned, lupus, MS, vitiligo, thyroid. It just depends on which tissue the immune system is mistaking as an enemy.
And you maybe explained it in that first question, but why does the immune system suddenly start attacking itself instead of the invaders?
It's a good question. And, there is a piece of it that is related to our genetic makeup. So oftentimes there is something that, like I mentioned, is in our genes, and a certain trigger can happen. And there's lots of theories as to what the triggers could be that causes it to kind of flip the switch and turn into that pathologic state. So genes can definitely play a role. One of the most common triggers is stress or stress related events. And what's stressful for one person may be more stressful, may not be the same as what's stressful for another person. So it's can be unpredictable, because if your body senses that something is stressful, that's often when we see, these diagnoses come to light and, lead to getting a diagnosis.
I think I found it interesting hearing you say that genetics and stress can play a part. To what extent could also diet play a part in this as well?
So that kind of brings up a good question of, I mentioned the genetic piece of it. So depending on the disease, depending on which, research you're looking at, that piece of the puzzle that we cannot control. So the genes that we have, that's anywhere from 10 to 30% estimated of the contributing causes. The other 70 to 90% is in our environment, our habits, our lifestyle. And so food is one piece of that. It could be how we move our body. It could be how we think and feel. It can be relationships. It can be challenges, like you said, food, movement, all these things that make up our environment. It could be toxins. It could be infections. The thing that is helpful to divide it out amongst, what is the part we can't control and what is the part we can control, is that when we look at, what we'll probably spend a majority of time talking about today, where are we going to put our attention when we're choosing health? I choose health. And
Right.
so do we want to focus on the 10 to 30% of the part we can't control? No, because that's frustrating and won't get us very far. But when we look at this menu of things that are under some level of our influence and under our control that can impact our future outcome, that's where empowerment comes in. And that's where choice starts to add up day in and day out.
So, people hear autoimmune and think it's one disease. How many are there really?
The number is on the rise. And so when I started this work, almost 10 years ago, I think the number was around 80. Now it's over 100. There are different diagnoses that are happening year after year. Some even they change their diagnoses. They'll include some diseases that they used to call one thing now are split into different things. So that number is a moving target, but there are quite a few. And again, they all have this commonality of the immune system is, not regulating itself in the way that it should be.
So could you explain why so many autoimmune conditions go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed for years? Does it have anything to do with the fact that autoimmune diseases are still being discovered? Like, why is it that, they're so undiagnosed or misdiagnosed for years?
Well, there's it can be hard to diagnose because the symptoms when they start can be very vague. They could describe many different diseases. And just like you said, there are some diseases that some of us may be walking around with that we just haven't put a label on yet, or we don't have a specific name. So you're right. People often, a part of their autoimmune story is that it's taken longer than we wish for anybody to have to go through, looking for answers. It takes longer than average because the symptoms can be so vague. It can describe many different things. It can be really hard to measure in lab tests. And so it really does take a diligence, and it takes, people advocating for themselves and finding, you know, physicians and practitioners who will listen and help them get to the bottom of it.
Now, I wonder because, you think about diseases from a long time ago. You go back as far as 1400s and the plague and all that. But is autoimmune disease a modern problem, or have humans always dealt with this?
Interesting question. I don't know how far back, but they do, believe that there is some sort of mismatch happening with our bodies and the modern world.
Hmm.
So back to what you mentioned as something that's probably on other people's minds too is our food doing something to contribute to this? And, I tend to believe that yes, the food, our environment, like we said, different toxins we're exposed to, something is causing our immune systems, our bodies, our cells, because really our organs that this is in fact infecting or impacting, excuse me, our organs are made up of tissues and cells, and the basic building blocks of those cells comes from the food we eat, the thoughts we think, that, all the inputs, these controllables that are building our body. And so there does appear to be something with the modern world that our bodies are not liking. So I don't think it's a far leap to say that as these numbers go up, more and more. And the other thing that's pointing to that is that it's happening in younger and younger generations. So there are diseases that, MS, for example, MS, the typical onset would be from age 20 to 40, still a young person's disease, but now it's happening even younger, kids as young as 8, 10, 12. And so much so that there are pediatric specialists for these different autoimmune diseases. So something is not matching up. And, our modern world has so many great things. We were just talking before we recorded how neat to be able to make the sound of this podcast sound even better with the help of AI and modern technology. But those things potentially play out very differently in our health and in our bodies.
Now, is autoimmune disease, and I know you touched on this before, is it only genetic, or can it come out of nowhere? And I know in your case, you said you were 17, your first experience. So kind of, flesh that out a little bit more as well.
Yeah, certain different diagnoses will have different percentages assigned to the increased likelihood if you have a family member with that diagnosis. MS is definitely one of those. I don't have any family members that I know of who have that disease. I do have family members with autoimmune thyroid disease called Hashimoto's. So there's definitely links between different diagnoses and higher chances. But again, you will find some variability with different diagnoses with that. But there does seem to be a connection related to our genes.
So there are approximately 3 to 4 people that I know personally that have autoimmune diseases, and they have one thing in common, and they're all women. Why are women so much more likely to develop autoimmune diseases?
There's a psychologist and an author and just a really well-known leader in this field. His name is Gabor Mate, if I'm
Yes.
saying his name correctly. And he is such a beautiful, I just love the way he describes this. And he talks about, some of the characteristics that we as women have in terms of, how we carry the weight of families and generations and the weight of the world in some different ways. So that is potentially tied back to what our body is perceiving as a stress, as a heavy event. And so that makes the most sense to me in terms of hearing him describe it. And it's interesting you say that because so many people, I been a pharmacist for almost 20 years and, about 6 years ago decided to go back to school to learn more about functional medicine, to learn more about coaching and helping people who want to change some of these controllables, these lifestyle inputs that we can control. And so many people I see who are doing similar things, they say they work with women who have MS, who have Hashimoto's, who have these various things. And I've even been recommended by certain people to say, well, maybe you should work with women. And maybe I lucked out that my first 2 clients ever were men. But, women do get the spotlight, but men do get these diagnoses as well. And, to have a place that, to be able to recognize that men and women both do get it. But yes, you're right. Women does seem to be a higher percentage, especially for some diagnoses.
Now, is it possible for autoimmune diseases to go into remission, or is it always progressive?
Great question. And yeah, again, these are different diagnoses that we're talking about, but absolutely we can have times when our bodies do go into a remission or a lower state of disease activity. And that most likely is that the immune system has calmed down. It's not in that overactive state. Different things can put us into more of a remission and not a chronic march forward. Certain amazing disease modifying therapies that can impact our immune system from a medication level. There are also, again, things that we do with our lifestyle. Certain foods and certain exercises, certain mindfulness, different things work for different people. But to call any diagnosis chronic and progressive, even if the facts point that way, that's not a way that I choose health, essentially because even if it's true, and even if my symptoms are going to get worse, and even if, statistically things go in a certain direction, choosing to think that way, usually, always for me, usually for most people, has us feeling like discouraged, fearful, disempowered. And so instead choosing to say, maybe mine won't be progressive. Maybe I can impact this, leads us to feeling in ways that help us do things that are more in line with healing. And so that's a big differentiator between one of the ways I look at health and one of the ways I help people look at health is that a lot of what we do starts in how we're thinking and feeling. And so some of those labels that could be put on autoimmune disease may not be serving us because if, we're not arguing with whether it's right or wrong, but instead just putting the best possible path forward by putting out there that there's a chance that we can, impact this thing and keep it from becoming, a chronic and progressive disease.
So I'm gonna ask you to get a little bit vulnerable with us, and you have already. But after the first autoimmune diagnosis when you were 17, and then come into the second one, and then obviously with MS being the last. At what point was there ever a point where you started to blame yourself for the current situation or for the situation then? And then was there a point of weakness where you felt like, okay, like I just have to like surrender to this thing, or was there a decided point of strength where you're like, okay, and of course you have, I need to do something about this. I need to find a way to manage this.
Yeah. So in the first part of the question is, did I ever feel like it was my fault? Did I ever think it was my fault? Not for an extended amount of time, but I will say a lot of people, so many of my clients, when they find me, do feel guilt. They feel guilt because they think there's something they could have done differently, or they feel guilt because they now have the diagnosis and they think, why aren't I not doing the things to make this better that I know could help make it better? And so if you're thinking that, if you're a listener and you feel that, you are not alone. I think it's very human to try to, find an answer. And even if that answer is potentially blaming ourselves. Very early on, back to looking at what thoughts served me, very early on, deciding to choose to think that it was always meant to happen this way. This was always going to happen. Now, what am I going to do next? Was a thought that just felt really loving. It felt really compassionate to myself, and it felt very nurturing. And it felt like it inspired me to then take on a problem solving approach to now what? Now what can I do? And so the answer is, I fortunately, maybe because of the emphasis I've put on my mindset and really questioning the thoughts and feelings that I have, it's a skill that just keeps paying me back again and again, because if a thought that does not feel good is let loose and let allowed to fester and breed and grow, then we can end up feeling pretty discouraged by it. Having a practice of looking and questioning, is it really true that I could have prevented this? And there's no way to prove that. And so why not decide the other way, the exact opposite? Why not decide there isn't anything I could have done? And again, if anybody's listening and they feel guilt because they haven't changed something that they want to change, they're not alone either. I mean, as humans, it's hard to undo lifelong patterns. And so having some compassion from that and learning how to work with our brain to change in a way that feels good and not in a way that feels like we're punishing ourselves is such a useful tool and skill to develop moving forward.
And I wonder, what's the greatest thing you've learned about your resilience throughout this experience?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think MS, when I was waiting for that diagnosis, MS was kind of my worst case scenario. I really, of all the different options, from what I knew about it in school, I remember learning about it. I remember thinking and even saying to a friend once, like, oh gosh, I would never want MS. And so it really was this worst case scenario. But getting to survive your worst case scenario, getting to turn it into something that you learn from, grow through, make different choices after is the most, empowering thing that I can look at in my life is when I think about, okay, what's my current worst case scenario in anything that I'm facing, then calling back and remembering, oh, you survived another time you thought that that was your worst case scenario. That's really empowering. And that really helps me to keep things in perspective and to have the trust and confidence that I will figure it out and do what it takes to, again, choose to still be healthy, even when something threatens to take that away. And it often requires redefining what health looks like. It may look different than it did in the past, but nobody can take that away from me because I define what it means and I get to decide if I have it or not.
Now, when it comes to dealing with autoimmune diseases, is fatigue really that bad, or are people exaggerating that?
My goodness, fatigue could really be that bad. Everybody's reality is their reality. So if somebody is feeling that fatigue, then, to honor that and to, not minimize that is so important. I like to break down fatigue into two different things. There's the medical reasons for fatigue. That could be nutrient deficiencies. That could be certain medications. That can be very real things happening in your body that are keeping you from having the energy you need to be able to feel like you can get through your day well. Then there's also the fatigue that is made worse by the way we're thinking about our fatigue, the way we talk about our fatigue, the way we avoid making changes that we know could help our fatigue. And so it's more empowering when we realize that a portion of our fatigue maybe could be lessened if we're willing to shift some habits, if we're willing to try something different to give our bodies and our brains better quality input. You get what you give. And so let's give our bodies some good energizing thoughts and food and movements. And, you probably see that quite a bit with training people. Even if we're tired when we come into an exercise, doing exercise that's loving in the moment, at the other side of it, we end up feeling more energy.
Yep.
And so yeah, really looking at what is the real fatigue that's happening that we're not going to deny, we're not going to ignore. But given that this fatigue is real, what can we do to minimize it? And there are always things that we can do to minimize it, even if it's just the way we're talking about it. I often have my clients, we talk about a strategy that we use a lot called words matter. So the words we're thinking, the words we're saying, and if sometimes it's just a habit that we're saying, I'm tired, I'm fatigued, I'm exhausted. and it starts to be a habit. And so that habit can actually make us feel more tired. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so one shift, if anybody has that, you notice yourself thinking or feeling or talking about how little energy you have, is try to pair it with something a little more energizing, even in your words. One of my favorite ones is, I am exhausted and I get to go to bed early tonight. That shift to include something just as true and a little bit more positive, a little bit more energizing, can really help to change the state of our cells and the state of our body. And yeah, these are examples of little strategies to not add to it, but to actually minimize it and start to lighten that load a little bit.
As you said, that just really hit home for me how much we are really creatures of habit, and not just creatures of habit, but sometimes more than anything, creatures of bad habit. And
Mhm.
I know it's probably taboo to list anything as good and bad nowadays, but I think, as you said, when I think about certain things that add to that fatigue, whether that's a lack of sleep or at least not getting enough sleep, or as you said, the way that we think about fatigue. Like sometimes I'll talk to someone and I'll notice that they'll ask me how I'm doing, and I'll like just naturally go to, well, I'm tired, right? When in
Yeah.
reality, biologically and cellularly, I don't really feel that way, but
Yeah.
I still do that. So it's just a really interesting observation.
Yeah. Or even, breaking down tired into the different types of tired there are. Like imagine if we responded accurately and said, oh, today my muscles are tired, or I'm physically tired. Or today, you know what? It's a heavy emotion day. I'm emotionally tired. Or maybe we're cognitively tired because we've been thinking hard. When we narrow down how we describe our fatigue, how we describe our tiredness, it actually in itself is an energy saver. Because when we just throw out this blanket, I'm tired, that takes more energy. It uses up more of our energy. And so getting specific, getting granular is one way to help slow the bleed, so to speak.
Now, I know we spoke about diet before, are there foods that consistently make autoimmune symptoms worse?
This is a good question for this week. We're recording in January of 2026, and there were just some new updated dietary guidelines for the first time in a really long time. And there's some good changes in it. And the reason I bring those up is that it solidifies what I've been teaching for years, that we have to find the foods that are good for us, the foods that are not good for us, and the foods that we want to explore and experiment with to see if they're good for us. So I call them yes foods, no foods, and maybe so foods. Now, to answer your question, for the most part, no foods for most human bodies are ultra processed foods. And the guidelines call that out. And the reason we can say that so confidently is they have ingredients and we don't even recognize when we read them on a label. So our body probably doesn't even recognize them as food either. And so whenever we are giving ourselves, foods that are food-like substances, they're not even real food,
Mhm.
that's the building block that our body is using to create new cells, to fix new layers of skin as they shed off, and that's happening all throughout our body. So I think it's pretty safe to say overall that ultra processed foods are ones that most people know it. They feel like crap when they eat too much of it. Of course they crave it because that's what it's designed to do, but that doesn't mean that it can never enter our bodies, but limiting that as much as possible can really go a long way.
Now, what's your take? Because, there's various diets that people follow. I myself follow a vegan diet.
Hmm.
I've been vegan for almost 20 years now. But what's your take on gluten, dairy, and sugar for autoimmune patients?
Yep, and I'm with you. I've danced around the diet areas, really trying to find what works for me. So I had a couple years where I was a vegan, some years as a vegetarian, some more in paleo, and ultimately I now follow the Amy protocol. And you're listening to that and you're like, what in the world does that mean? Well, what that means for me is it is food that helps me feel good. So I use the science, I use what I know about the science to start my experiment. And then I take notice what's happening in my body, what's happening with my energy, what's happening with my symptoms, my lab tests. and really finding a protocol of food, not just what I eat, what we eat, but when do we eat? How do we eat? Who do we eat with? What do we, what do we, who do we share food with? All these different pieces that make up the emotional piece of food, and finding a protocol that you feel really, really good about and one that you can follow. So for me, what that looks like is I kind of call it, things to decrease inflammation. So I choose not to eat gluten. There is data about, how gluten affects people with autoimmune disease, specifically through some mechanisms that are happening in the gut lining, and the fact that gluten can sometimes break down the integrity of our intestinal lining, and it causes some things to make it through our GI tract that then looks like triggers for our immune system. So again, you will find different experts who argue the validity of that science, but at the end of the day, someone needs to try it and see how they feel. There's enough science out there and enough case reports to say, wow, this is really worth it for me to see if I feel different or if my symptoms get better. Same thing with dairy. I choose not to eat dairy. A lot of people don't tolerate dairy in different ways. It's an experiment that people need to run. The other thing with sugar for the most part, too much of it, and the poison's in the dose. So too much of it for most people, we see some effects that aren't great.
Can you can you make a distinction with the sugar? Because what I hear a lot nowadays is, people saying things like, well, be careful with fruit because fruit has sugar.
Yeah.
And when you speak about sugar in the context of autoimmune disease and maybe just health overall, are you looking more so at refined sugars or the sugars that we use a lot in the processed foods, or are you looking at sugar on a whole?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of comes back to that ultra processed food. If we were eating less ultra processed food, we'd be eating a whole lot less gluten. We'd be eating a whole lot less sugar. And so again, I choose, if it's a natural whole food, I choose to eat it. I think that yes, there's sugar in fruit and there's sugar in sweet potatoes, but it's packaged up with a whole lot of goodness that also comes with it: the fiber, the micronutrients, the macronutrients. And that's just an experiment that has played out well time and time again. And most of my clients, most of the people I work with, they feel the same. Now, if someone notices that they're eating 10 servings of fruit because they just can't get enough, then, it may be worth looking at and saying, why do I feel like I need so much fruit? Or, am I using this to replace something else? But for the most part, eat real food. I mean, real food is packaged with so many other things. A lot of artificial sweeteners come in when people try to limit sugar, and the word artificial is in the name. It's artificial. Our bodies don't quite know what to do with that. And so they can wreak havoc in all sorts of ways. So, I think it's, wise to experiment with yourself and say, how much sugar do I feel okay with? And how much better could I feel if I tried to get rid of some of these things?
And I wonder also, is there a difference between, a good healthy exercise and autoimmune friendly exercise? And are you able to list, I know that, you're pretty much in the holistic field of things, and maybe not necessarily a trainer, but are there specific exercises that you may recommend for your clients or exercises that you use yourself?
The movement that you will do, the movement that feels good, is the movement that I always recommend people go with. There's always going to be a safety component. So as with anything, making sure that you're safe from a balance or a injury standpoint, but getting bogged down with finding the perfect workout keeps us from moving our body. So start with what feels good. In my mind, I'm always thinking, okay, how can I stretch and how can I think about my flexibility? How can I look at my strength? How can I look at my endurance? And how can I look at my balance? Those are like the 4 pillars that I think make up a really well-rounded routine. And those can overlap too. You can have things that work on flexibility and balance, but getting a piece of those each week can help us as we fight this diagnosis that we all have, which is aging, an aging body. We want to keep moving. We want to stay limber. And yeah, a body in motion stays in motion time and time again. So I work with people with some pretty severe limitations in their mobility or in movement, but we are the same. We all benefit from moving our breath, moving any extremity we can, working the muscles of our core, working things, getting creative when certain movements that maybe you once loved are no longer available because of a diagnosis or because of aging. That doesn't mean that we stop and throw in the towel. That just means we get really creative to how do we get that blood pumping? How do we build strength in a way that we still are able to? And that just takes a willingness to find other ways.
And speak to us about your podcast, which is the Autoimmune Health Secrets. Just to us about how that has helped you, not just helped you in your perspective on autoimmune diseases, and then how it's helped, listeners and your patients as well.
Yes, I love talking about the podcast because we realize, like you mentioned, like hearing about habits. Okay, that struck home. Healthier habits leading to a healthier life is not a secret. Like if any of us probably have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 habits that we know if we could just make or break this habit, we would feel better and we would be healthier. So that is not the secret. The secrets that I am revealing on Autoimmune Health Secrets is how to actually make them happen, how to actually incorporate them in your life so that they are not just something that someone else does or that you get motivated by for a couple days but then drop off. But how do we make these healthier habits habitual, by definition, and make them a part of who we are? So the podcast is just all about the how of changing habits. I'm never telling you exactly what you should do. I'm giving you options of this is what's helping people. This is what the science says. Now let's figure out, why aren't you doing it? Why aren't you doing what you want to be doing? And that's my sweet spot as a coach. That is my expertise, to take anything you want to be doing and help you do it. Bottom line, we don't stop trying until you do it. We get creative. We find workarounds and we make it work for you. That just takes knowing a lot about the human brain and what keeps us stuck. So there's a strategy behind it. There's a lot of really good habit change and behavior change research that I draw from, and hopefully package it up in a way where you get to come in, learn a thing or two about the body, about a habit that could help, and then you leave empowered and ready to take action so it can change your life.
And Amy, just let people know, well, two things: what is next for Amy Behimer, and where people can find you on social media and the web, just to work with you as well.
Well, it's the beginning of a year. Next for me are some goals, some health goals, some movement goals, some mindset goals, all the goals that I am helping other people set, I'm doing right alongside with you. So, if anybody doesn't have a goal, or you find that you resist having a goal, then I would challenge you that you may be thinking about goals not in a productive way. Having something to work towards and having, approach that helps you put it into action today is everything. It changes how we feel and it changes how we function. So what's next for me is personally continuing to choose health, continually, working with my body to live a really good life. And at the same time, I want to help other people do the same thing. So I have a coaching program. It's called Club Habit Hub. So it combines coaching, personalized coaching, community, a really nurturing community, and curriculum. So we can learn some things, we're going to put them into action. And yeah, that's the best place to hang out and do this work together. And you can find me, like you mentioned, on my podcast, which is Autoimmune Health Secrets. You can explore more about coaching together. I'm just such a fan of coaching, and really want to make it accessible to more people, because, sometimes it's easy to think, oh, if I need a coach, that means I'm doing something wrong. And that's just, the biggest lie that our brains can tell ourselves. Getting support for things, that we want is one of the smartest and wisest things we can do. So that's what I get to help people do. And that, I can include the link in the show note for that.
Good. And also on social media, is it Amy Behimer as well?
Yep. It's at amybehimercoaching.com. And that's on Instagram. And, we can include it in the show notes, or on Instagram, you'll see I created a quiz that actually helps you identify the first habit, that if you want to make a change, to feel better, to function better, it helps you identify what that habit could be that could really move the needle for you, that could really give you the biggest bang for the buck. So that quiz is available, and a really good starting place if anything we talked about, you're like, I'm interested in that, autoimmune disease or not.
Amy, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. Thank you for being vulnerable with us. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. This is really, for me, this is really part one, because I probably do have a lot more questions to go through with you. So I'm pretty sure we'll have Amy back on the show pretty soon. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, this is Stefan Leslie with the I Choose Health podcast. Just reminding you that choosing health is about choosing power, possibility, and purpose.
Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.
This is week 40 of 52 choices. This week we're saying to prioritize quality sleep. Sleep isn't a luxury, it's a biological necessity. Consistently getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep allows your brain to consolidate memory, your body to repair tissues, and your immune system to stay balanced. Research shows that chronic sleep deprivation increases inflammation, disrupts hormones that regulate hunger and stress, impairs focus and decision making. This week, treat sleep like a non-negotiable. Aim for a consistent bedtime, limit screens before bed, and create a calm sleep environment. When you protect your sleep, you're not just resting, you're actively supporting your long-term health, energy, and resilience. This week's choice: go to bed on purpose. Your body will thank you.